He's off the leash. He's politically incorrect.
And totally testosteronic.
This is The Gary Bushell Show.
Good evening, culture lovers. You're listening to a very special St George's Day edition of The Gary Bushell Show here at the oasis of free thinking that is wonderful Radio Litopia. Tonight we're going to consider Englishness and what it means in the 21st century. Does it mean anything? Has England got a future? Does it deserve one? And how do we define being English? Joining me in the studio for tonight's show is Robin Tilbrook, the founder and chairman of the English Democrats. Robin, I was half expecting you to have horns and a tail and be reeking of brimstone aftershave, but here you are looking very reasonable and agreeable. So let's start with that. Why are politicians who raise English matters automatically portrayed as being extreme or assumed to be extreme?
I don't know, Gary, but it's very nice to be here, and for St George's Day, what a treat. But I think it's probably to do with the fact that our opponents are fearful of what actually will happen when English people start to assert their English national identity. And in fact, of course, it is starting to happen. In the 2011 census, it turned out that more than 60% of people in England were saying that they were English only. And only about another 10% said they were English and British. And less than 30% all told, including that 10% that said that they were English and British, had mentioned that they were British at all in their national identity. So British establishment politicians do have something to fear from England, and I think they are starting to fear it, and that's why they carry on in this ridiculous manner and try and portray anybody that talks about England in a hostile way.
It isn't even a recent thing, is it? Because decades ago, George Orwell said, England is perhaps the only great country whose intellectuals are ashamed of their nationality. This establishment, is it, do you think, a product of colonial guilt? Is it something deeper than that?
Well, actually, more or less at the same time as George Orwell was saying that, A.J.P. Taylor was saying that he thought that the whole agenda for trying to talk about Britain and British rather than England and English in England was driven by British Scots. Who were prominent and important within various aspects of British national life, including, of course, within the BBC, with Lord Reith and so on, and many of the leading politicians, many of the leading people within the city, and it may well be that that's at the root of it. It's an attempt to try and write England out of the history. One of the remarks that I was aware of in starting the whole movement towards trying to create an English party, an English national party, was that we'd got the then leader of the Liberal Democrats, Charles Kennedy, saying that he was delighted with the idea of regionalisation, of splitting England up into regions, 9 regions, and he said he supported regionalisation because, and I quote, it's calling into question the idea of England itself. Calling into question the idea of England itself. In other words, it was a naked attempt to him to write out of history the whole idea of England.
That's quite incredible, isn't it? And of course, it was Tony Blair, born, we should just say, in case anyone's forgotten, in Scotland, and grew up in Scotland, who tried to introduce regionalisation and failed. It was one of those big failures. It was John Prescott, born in Wales, who said there's no such nationality as English. It's a theme, isn't it? It's a theme. There's something about England, and you'd think that no other nation in the world, no other people in the world are asked to question their motives for even describing themselves as being English. You wouldn't say to a Scot, why are you calling yourself Scottish? But if you call yourself English, it's almost like, well, there's an implication, certainly amongst the Guardian reading intelligentsia in this country, that it's somehow a racist thing to do. There's nothing racist about it at all.
No, there's nothing racist about it. I disagree very slightly, because I suspect if you were, for instance, in Iran, and you were trying to assert that you were a Kurd, you'd find that you were subject to the same kind of troubles as you are if you say you're English in
probably worse, actually.
In the UK. It could get worse. Certainly the Turks, who have also a Kurdish national population, they have a history of fairly extreme behaviour towards some of the Kurds who've tried to assert Kurdishness. So actually, I think it probably is something that where you've got a national identity that's beginning to assert itself, and that the establishment of that state is aware that this is happening, you do get some attempts to suppress it, and some of that attempt is at a sort of cultural level, the sort of thing that we're talking about, where you're being sort of labelled with otherwise completely ridiculous labels, but the point is that the attempt is to try and shut you up.
Now, moving away from that knee-jerk liberal cultural sneer, there is also a very solid reason for the existence of your party, I think. I think you'd agree if I say that, because there is a democratic imbalance that's been caused in the UK by devolution and what is referred to as the West Lothian question. Could you talk people through that? Because might have people listening from other countries who wouldn't quite realise what was going on.
Basically, we've got Scotland's got its own parliament and government. Wales has got its own parliament to all intents and purposes, the Senate, and its own government. Northern Ireland has got its own parliament and government. It's a bit of a special case, Northern Ireland, but certainly as far as Scotland and Wales are concerned, there is a noticeable difference between the way that they're being treated and England. England is still being directly ruled from Westminster by the British government and the British Parliament. There's no Secretary of State that looks after England or tries to speak for England. There's no department which identifies itself as being specifically for England. And usually politicians, when they're talking about things, try and sort of skate over the issue by saying our country or our nation or something like that, something unspecific, so that they're not being clear as to who actually they're talking about, what nation they're talking about. But if you think of the National Health Service, there is now no longer a British National Health Service. There is an English National Health Service, where we are being charged £7.85 per prescription. In Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it's free. If you go and park at a NHS car park in England, you'll be charged. There are many drugs not available to English NHS patients that are available to Scottish and Welsh ones. If you're treating Scotland, Wales and England as being part of the same state, which in principle we ought to be, I suppose, at the moment, whilst the UK is still there, the fact is we are being discriminated against.
Is it not the case that we're also disproportionately subsidising?
It is. In 2009, there was a House of Lords crossbench committee which tried to work out the sums as to exactly how much the transfer was from English taxpayers to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Turns out it runs at £49 billion a year, 32 billion of which goes to Scotland. And so you are talking about one of the biggest transfers of wealth from one country to another that's occurring almost anywhere in the world that I'm aware of. And it's occurring without people really being fully aware of it, without people really having been asked to give a democratic mandate to that happening. I think it's the more people discover this, and in fact it is one of those things that people are gradually becoming aware of. The more people are aware of it, the more outraged they are about it. And certainly as far as the West Lothian question, which is what you were asking me about, which is where Scottish MPs in particular, because the MP in question, Tam Dalyell, was from West Lothian, who raised this back in the 70s. Scottish MPs still vote on still vote on English-only matters. It hasn't made a crucial difference in very many votes so far, but it did make a crucial difference in creating the whole business under Tony Blair of charging students in England for attending English universities for top-up fees, as it was then called.
Let me get this straight. In theory and in practice, Scottish MPs and Welsh MPs can push through measures against the interests of the English people and against the interest of English MPs?
Yes.
Or in contradiction to the views of English MPs?
Well, what had happened in that particular case was that the majority of English MPs were against the imposition of top-up fees in the House of Commons. The Labour government got that measure through by getting the Scottish MPs and the Welsh MPs to vote for something that their own governments had decided they weren't going to do. impose that on English students. And I think that would be as clear an example as you could possibly have of the idea of the West Lothian question. One of the things I found quite encouraging in the last few weeks is we've had an official report by the commission that was being chaired by Sir William Mackay, who's a very establishment figure. He'd been the parliamentary counsel, in other words, responsible for drafting parliamentary bills, and very much part of the sort of British establishment, but obviously of Scottish origin, with a name like Sir William Mackay. He's done a very fair report, I think, in which he's actually looked at the different ways in which England is being treated by comparison to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and has reported back that, in his view, we should no longer talk about the West Lothian question, because there is a wider issue. It's not just the way Parliament operates, but it's also the way government operates, because we haven't got our own Secretary of State looking after England. We haven't got anybody who's trying to speak for England in government. We haven't got a government for England or a First Minister for England. And so if you put together the West Lothian question, which is simply about representation within Parliament, with the whole issue of how England is governed, then he says that what we ought to be talking about is the English question.
But that's the word they don't even use. England and English is almost like Churchill said, wouldn't it, is a word that...
Well, it's coming back. It's coming back, and it's partly coming back because people have been determined to try and make it come back and to talk about it.
He called it, didn't he?
He did.
But it seems to me, speaking to you and meeting to you and chatting before, that you're a natural Conservative yourself. The English people on, I think, election after election are probably naturally Conservative. Why aren't you fighting for this inside the Conservative Party when you might have more clout? Why go outside? And it's a harder fight, isn't it?
Well, I suppose it is in a way.
When there's no choice,
you are right. I was a Conservative, but I think having been a Conservative and sort of come out of it, you probably become more zealously reformed than if you had never been in there in the first place. The thing is that the Conservative Party does describe itself as the Conservative and Unionist Party. David Cameron has kindly told us that he's quite happy for English taxpayers' money to be used to give extra subsidies to Scotland, because he says, I am a Cameron and there's plenty of Scottish blood flowing in these veins. That's what he told Andrew Marr, which I think, you know, if anybody else had tried to make such a blatantly sort of ethnic point, people would have been screaming racist all over the place, wouldn't they? He's also said that he's going to fight the sour little Englanders wherever he finds them. So you are looking at a party where there's a very strong focus on Britishness, and the whole idea of the sort of multinational state of Britishness. Also, of course, they're the party of big business rather than focusing on nationalism and so on. So actually, I think the Conservative Party is probably one of those parties that you'd never get to focus really on England. And those people who are still within the Conservative Party but think somehow it's going to become more of an English nationalist party, I just think they're wrong.
I'll get back to things like unionism and the other matters you mentioned in a bit. But what I wanted to ask you first was, if you attained your goal, which is the creation of an English Parliament, it still wouldn't be enough, would it? Because we'd still be part of the EU. And democracy within the EU is an illusion. It's like this whole thing with the SNP. It's a fake nationalism. It's a false nationalism. We're going to be independent from England, but we're going to be subservient to Brussels. How does that work?
Yes, I'm not sure that the SNP actually feels quite that way. That's certainly the way they position themselves. But I think, having talked to quite a few of them, that actually many of them are that's a positioning that's useful in terms of not frightening people that they are separatists. This is the expression that the SNP get very nervous about people using about them. And so what they're really trying to say is that we can be Scottish nationalist. We want to separate from England, because England's the enemy, really, in this context. And at the same time, we're not separatists, so we're happy to stay within the EU. I think for a lot of SNP supporters, they are people who would probably quite happily be separate from the EU as well. But at the moment,
What about yourself? Where do you stand?
it's. I certainly think as an English nationalist, I just don't see how you could possibly construct a programme and sort of package which would justify being pro-EU. I mean, I can see how Scottish nationalists might, because they get a lot of money out of the EU. But even so, I think that they're on thin ice, because after all, the EU is rather against the idea of nationalism generally. And it's not democratic either, which I would also find offensive. But in terms of the actual money situation, for England, it doesn't make any sense, because we're paying a lot of money into the EU, and we don't get the equivalent back from the EU. So in other words, it's a net loss financially.
It has been right from the start.
It has been right from the start. The only way it's been possible to argue in favour of any sort of a balance towards the EU is by looking at the whole British position. And if you look at money going into Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, and you add that back in, then you can get to a point where the amount of money going out is not so outrageous. But if you take out Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland from the equation, and you just look at England, there's a huge amount of money been flooding out for 30 plus years, 35 years now, 40 years.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. You're from quite a well-to-do background. Nothing wrong with being from a well-to-do background, of course. Would your England be more for the toffs than the common man? I mean, is there a shared system of values? Is there?
I think there is, Gary. But I mean, the point about nationalism surely has always been that it's about the whole people.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of nationalism or national identity is that it's part of our sort of altruistic feeling. It's part of our feeling of community. It's what encourages us to pay our taxes and to help our neighbour and so on.
Isn't that patriotism, which is a different thing from nationalism?
Oh, what is it really? I don't think it is much.
I think patriotism is a natural emotion, whereas nationalism is a more bellicose thing. I think it's a more...
I don't think that.
As well as the fact that the only people who've called themselves nationalism, probably for the last 30 years up until recently, have been people who are actually racial nationalists, who are a completely different thing, who are very...
Well,
dubious.
I'm not sure whether that's right. I mean, it's certainly true that the Irish nationalists have called themselves nationalists for a lot longer than that.
Yes.
The Scottish nationalists have been calling themselves nationalists ever since 1927, when the SNP were formed. Clyde Cymru, the Party for Wales, I mean, they're Welsh nationalists, and they date back to the late 19th century.
Aren't these unfortunate comparisons? Because you've got... In the name of Plaid Cymru, there's been arson attacks on English property in Wales. In the name of Irish nationalism, there's been bombs going off in our cities. In the name of Scottish nationalism, there's been people attacked for being English. It seems that... See what I mean? This is what I'm saying. Nationalism has a nasty side, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, I suppose any political stance has a nasty side if you take it too far. I mean, after all, we're constantly hearing talk from the left of how nationalism is so bad. But what are the skeletons in their cupboard? Well, surely they've got to be some of the greatest mass murderers in all human history, with Stalin and Mao Zedong and so on.
All of whom practiced socialism in one country, which was a form of nationalism itself.
Any creed that's taken too far does, inevitably lead to problems.
This is, though, the essential difference, isn't it? I would have thought between you and something like the BNP is that you are not racial nationalists. You define nationalism as a civil nationalism, as a legal thing.
Well, I think there are actually. I'm a solicitor, so I can't help but put my sort of legal hat on a bit with that kind of question. There are three versions of Englishness that are recognised in our law at the moment. There's national identity, which is probably what we're mostly talking about, where it's about how people define themselves. And the example that I often give is Americanism. After all, Americanism is a sense of community, a sense of national identity, which is quite clearly not a racial sense. There's also the English law, or the UK law under the Equalities Act, does actually recognise English as an ethnic group. And it also recognises English as a racial group. In fact, one of the leading cases on English as a racial group is a Scottish case where an English journalist, Mark Souster, who's currently the rugby correspondent for The Times, at that time he was employed by the BBC in Scotland to talk about to present programmes about rugby, and he found himself under a lot of pressure from Scottish colleagues, where they were sort of harassing him and basically being thoroughly racist towards him, and forced him out of his job. And he took on the BBC and beat them. That is the leading legal authority for the idea that English is a racial group, as well as any other of the three that are recognised by law.
Except surely, I mean, I know people who are third generation. Who, if you went back to their grandfather, they were West Indian. Their dad and mum were born in England, in London. They were born in London. They're English, aren't they?
Well, they would be English on the in the legal sense.
Would they be English in your sense?
Yes. I mean, as you know, Gary, we've stood non-white candidates, and are very happy to do so. Our issue is to try and get people to support fairness for England. That's what we're really about. Yeah. But I was just talking in terms of the legal
side, yeah, of course.
Side.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've got some involvement with a new union called the Workers of England Union, the majority of whose members are in fact not ethnically English, and we had an incident recently where a Unite official came into an NHS trust premises and started accusing members of being racist, including a West Indian member and an Asian member.
Oh dear.
Because they dared to mention the word England. You know, that was enough.
This mania of self-hatred that swoops through the middle class. And
this is the Gary Bushell Show on Wonderful Radio Latopia.
Let's talk about you for a bit. Let's go back when you were growing up. What were the cultural influences on you? What were the great works of English literature, the great English music, the great films, anything that was a... What was your culture? What were your influences growing up?
Well, my father was in the army, and we sort of moved around a lot, and I was sent off to boarding school fairly early, and I suppose I probably had a fairly conventional education with Shakespeare and Dickens and all the sort of classic novels and music and so forth.
And what do you read now? Do you read much now?
I read quite a lot of history books. I'm very interested in history. Of course, I read a fair bit of sort of political stuff to keep myself informed as to what's going on. I try and keep up with current affairs and news and so on. The sort of thing I read for escapism is very often science fiction, in fact. So I probably go from one extreme to another there.
Let's look a bit deeper at the English Democrats. For me, I think the slogans are a bit problematic. Both of the ones that I'm aware of are problematic. Could we say... Well, I think we've covered this a bit, but I'll just say it anyway. English, not British. Well, I'm both. I am English. Of course I'm English, and English for generations. But I'm also British. I feel British. I'm not. I don't hate the Welsh. I don't hate the Scots. I'm very quite chuffed by the things we've done together as a people, and I think it's a shame really to pull us apart.
Yes, I mean, in fairness, the slogan that we've I think almost always used in elections is English Democrats putting England first.
Oh, that's a good one.
And
Nothing wrong with that one.
And in fact, we took that and adapted it from a Conservative slogan, I think about 10 years ago in the EU elections. And they said they were putting Britain first, coming back to a point that we were making earlier about the way that the Conservatives look at things. But and we wanted to say that we were the party that wanted to put England first, and that's what we tend to say. We did. The only other election that I'm aware of where we said anything else was the police commission elections, where we said English Democrats, more police catching criminals. And we were very pleased, in fact, with our results there, because we saved all our deposits. We spent far less than any other party that was seriously trying to contest this, and in fact in South Yorkshire we came second in the elections, and probably we'd spent, well, in South Yorkshire I think we'd spent less than £500 on the campaign.
What about the other slogan, though, not left, not right, just English? I understand it, but the Times, I remember calling it disingenuous, in that they felt you couldn't, it was just like a smoke screen, if you like, because in fact it papered over cracks that shouldn't be papered over. You must, I think it was trying to say, you've got to be right wing. But you're saying, I think, the way I interpret it, tell me if I'm wrong, I think you're saying, until the English have got their own parliament, until we can make our own laws, nothing else matters.
I think that's right, Gary. I don't think that the idea of being English, the idea of our nation, and the idea of democracy for our nation is left or right. I think it's just a question of English. And I suppose in that sense, we're not left or right, we're just English. Also, in terms of our membership, we have got people who are, ex-Labour, ex-Liberal Democrat, ex-Conservative, ex-UKIP, ex-Conservative like myself, a few ex-BNP, one or two ex-Socialist Worker Party people. We have got people from right across the spectrum. Because, of course, the thing is, we are a new party, and people who may have thought that actually they'd like to be about something to do with English national identity and English nationalism, that simply wasn't the opportunity to be so before we came along, and so we do recruit from across the spectrum, and I don't think there's any harm in saying not right, not left, just English, when you have got people coming from right across the spectrum. If all our people had come from the so-called right, then that might be a bit disingenuous, but that's simply not true. And the other problem, in any case, with saying not left, the other problem with the sort of left-right type of analysis is that I think it works particularly badly with the sort of classic Anglo-Saxon worldview, because obviously the whole idea of left and right came from the French Revolutionary Assembly, and the right of France have always been very much about a big state, but for the glory of France. Yeah. So in other words, quite sort of militaristic. Whereas the sort of so-called right in the Anglo-Saxon world has tended to be small state, perhaps a bit
individual freedom. It's a different
individual
thing
freedom.
Altogether,
yeah, I mean, in other words, the ideas behind it are really quite different.
I don't know. I mean, to me, it's a false classification anyway, because
yes, exactly.
I look at the BNP's economic policies and I think, well, that's not a right-wing policy at all. That's pretty much a socialist policy.
Yes.
They're very much, to me, they're very much like the old Labour Party, yeah, but with an ethnic.
I think that's right, Gary. And in fact, actually, if you were to go back to the 1920s and 30s, as in fact Daniel Hannan, the Conservative MEP, was pointing out recently, nobody in the 1920s and 30s argued that Mussolini's fascism or the emergent Nazi party in Germany were right wing. They used to assume that they were left wing. That's why, after all, they were called the National Socialist Party. And Mussolini was a long-standing left-wing activist.
And so was Mosley. Mosley came from the Independent Labour Party.
Yeah, he'd been a cabinet minister in the Labour government.
Yes, yeah. So that's why his new movement involving the ex-communists as well. That was definitely a variation of socialism.
Whereas I do think. Nazism in particular was a sort of heresy of the left. It's probably part of the reason why the left have such a sort of visceral hatred for it, rather like the sort of heretics back in the Reformation, because the left tends to come up with this sort of artificial definition of people belonging to objective classes, the international proletariat or whatever. most people don't feel that they belong to such things. In other words, there's no consciousness of people that that's what they are. It's exactly the same true of Nazism. Nazism tries to sort of argue that the world history is made up of some sort of racial clash rather than the class clash.
Conspiracies, they believe,
yes,
don't they?
Well, exactly. So they're both trying to force people to think of themselves in a way that they don't. And it may not be any accident that both the far left and so-called far right in that context wind up killing lots of people because they're trying to force people to be something that they're not. Whereas I think one of the things that we're trying to do is simply to allow people to feel the way that they already feel, which is in our case, overwhelmingly English.
Can I ask you this, though? Even though I could understand... look, if, given the situation, given the fact that a lot of forces are trying to portray this sense of English identity, the English cause as being a right-wing cause, is it then a sensible thing to do to have people from the BNP members, ex-members, coming over to you? Would you not be better off to have a blanket ban on people who could be associated with hatred?
I think that those parties that make out they've got a blanket ban are simply being deceptive and hypocritical. And in fact, if you examine their track record, they've often allowed many people from the BNP and the far-right National Front or whatever to come in. And after all, to take it as another example, Labour, they've currently got at least two councillors that I'm aware of who've come over from the so-called far-right. One was a BNP council candidate and elected councillor and had been an organiser for the BNP up in Lancashire, in Darwin, Trevor Maxfield, there's another one in Milton Keynes.
Certainly the Labour Party had no problem accommodating people who were linked to the Communist Party for years, for decades. You had Labour MPs writing for the Morning Star blatantly. You've still had Harriet Harman just a couple of years ago saying how great Fidel Castro was. We thought, well, not two's victims he weren't. Yeah. There's a complete doublethink on this. There's two standards and a real hypocrisy running through the whole thing. I think
you're absolutely right, Gary. I think there is a hypocrisy about it, and I suppose it may be naive, but my attitude is that we ought to be as straightforward about it as possible. If somebody is a genuine convert to a moderate idea of English nationalism, which is about democracy and generally trying to do what's fair for our country.
It's the opposite of the extreme, isn't it?
I'm happy to take them.
It's a reasonable common sense policy, I think. You're actually at the very easy stage at the moment, because at this stage it's all sloganeering. Let's deal with the big issues. If you were in government now, if English Democrats were in government now, how would you revive the economy? How would you deal with multinational banks? What would your policy be for rebooting this failing alien economy?
Well, I do think one of the most interesting examples of a sort of national-centric approach to dealing with the financial problems that the world's got, one of the most interesting examples of something that has actually worked is Iceland. Because they allowed the banks to fail. They have actually charged and convicted their then Prime Minister of neglect.
Yeah.
They have changed their constitution to make it more democratically accountable. And actually their economy is picking up. It's not an inevitable and necessary approach to the problems that we've got. That the taxpayer should pick up the tab for mistakes made by bankers. And of course, the fact of the matter is that there's a huge amount of money being given to the banks at the moment by in effect, the taxpayer through the government. And they're not putting that back into the economy. Too often, they're using it to sort out their balance sheets and give themselves bonuses at the higher level of the banks. And the way that corporate capitalism works at the moment is it's given simply too much power to people who are fundamentally managers. They're not actually people with entrepreneurial ability. and they haven't come in as entrepreneurs. They've worked their way up through the system, and they're managers, and they get enormous rewards. And why? They don't justify such rewards.
This is The Gary Bushell Show on wonderful Radio Latopia. Check us out at latopia.tv/Gary.
Robin, we're talking after the sad death of Margaret Thatcher, who, love her or loathe her, as many people do, she was certainly a very important force in this country. She certainly changed Britain, whether it was for good or for bad. It's something I'm going to ask you. How do you feel about Meghan? Because I mean, she was in some ways an anti-establishment figure. She's a radical of the right. She opened it up. She deregulated. She made it. She was about meritocracy. She was about aspiration. She gave people from the working class opened doors for people to come through and make something of their lives. Is one theory. What do you feel?
Well, I think she was a radical liberal, really, in the classic 19th century sense of trying to have a free market economy and remove restrictions to the market. I do find it strange when I read some commentators saying that she was in some sense an English nationalist, because she certainly wasn't.
Well, she was English.
She was English, but not in a national identity sense. She saw herself as being British, I think, and very much so. Certainly a lot of her things that she would talk about in terms of Britishness were quite nostalgic for the sort of empire and so on. And I think a lot of the rhetoric that was used about the Falklands, for example, was about empire and so forth.
But was it though? I mean, here you had British citizens, all of them identify with Britain, all of them willingly British citizens on islands that had never belonged to Argentina, suddenly overrun by the troops of a fascist junta. Yes. What was wrong with us fighting for our own people?
I don't say there's anything wrong with fighting for it. I'm not trying to say that, but I think some of the rhetoric that was used to justify doing that, and the type of language that was used, did actually revert back to the sort of Rule Britannia, land of hope and glory type imperialist logic and references.
That always makes me laugh. Land of hope and glory, wider still and wider. Where's the wider still and
wider? Wider still and wider. Let thy bounds be set. God that made thee mighty, make thee mightier yet. Well, what could be more classic Edwardian imperialist?
But what would be wrong with a new United Kingdom where we've devolved parliaments in all the and maybe Southern Ireland would want to join us, better than being in the EU. What would be wrong with that?
I don't think you get Southern Ireland in.
You might do.
I know.
There's a few.
I know there are one or two people in UKIP who think that might happen, but I think that's a fantasy. I would hate to encourage them to go and canvass in the back streets of Dublin. I don't suppose we would ever see them again. But the fact is, as far as having a fair federal UK is concerned, there would be nothing wrong with that, and certainly that would be a good thing to happen, and is needed. We are quite a long way towards a federal UK at the moment. If we were sitting here in Scotland, we would already be living in effect a federal arrangement. It's just in England that we're left with sort of direct rule. And in fact, one of the commentators to the House of Commons committee that's recently reported on this, under the chairmanship of Graham Allen, the Constitution Committee, one of the commentators to that was saying that he thought that England was really the last part of the British Empire, which was ruled directly from the Whitehall Westminster system, rather than through its own representative and democratic institutions. So I'm not against the idea of that, but Mrs. Thatcher would have been against the idea of any devolution, and of course part of what actually caused her downfall in the end was listening to Scottish Conservatives to start having the poll tax up in Scotland first, and so her attitude to the political situation was hostile to any sort of nationalism within the various sort of nations within the UK.
There is a conspiracy theory that has it that the real reason she was deposed was it was an EU-engineered coup. That it was because she opposed the EU that the Wets organised to get rid of her.
The Wets certainly were much more pro-EU than she had become by then. But let's not forget, of course, that Mrs Thatcher campaigned for a yes vote to stay within the EU in the referendum.
I think she realised the error of her way, though.
Yes, I think she'd realised by towards the end that actually the EU was a sort of project to try and create a multinational supranational state. And she was opposed to that.
Well, that's the whole thing about it. It's always been cloaked in secrecy, the real motivation. It's always been sold to us as an economic trading bloc, which it never was. And it was never meant to be.
I think that's right. But we do have to remember with Mrs Thatcher's track record, she did vote and support staying in the EU when we had the referendum. And she did sign up to the Single European Act, which prior to the Lisbon Treaty, or EU Constitution, was actually the single largest step towards European integration. So her track record in office was, in actual fact, quite pro-EU. She did, however, help the Eurosceptic cause towards the end with her her Bruges speech, and the whole movement towards questioning the way that the EU was developing. And I think that's probably the kind of approach I'd probably adopt to Mrs Thatcher generally. I think it would be wrong not to recognise the fact that she's a very brave, courageous woman who's achieved a tremendous change in the country, made one of the sort of biggest differences that any post-war politician has managed to make. But at the same time, not everything that she did was right. And even she, over time, recognised that her earlier position on the EU, is the example we're talking about at the moment, was wrong.
I'd certainly agree with that. And I'd also say, although it was right that the nationalised industries were appalling, I think ever since, Thatcher's gone, but no Labour government since has tried to renationalise. Was privatisation quite as wonderful as it's made out to be? Because the privatisation of electricity, the resulting dissipation of our nuclear skills, is one of the reasons we'll still be having power cuts soon.
Yes. Well, actually, the outcome of some of the privatisation has in effect been to sell our core infrastructure assets to foreign companies, often to companies that whose own governments wouldn't allow us to buy their assets. Quite a good example was the question of our airports being sold to a Spanish company. The Spanish government wouldn't allow us to buy, or any other company coming from any country other than Spain, to buy Spanish airports. And one of the things, going back to an earlier question you were asking about the economy, one of the things that I would say is that we ought to have a level playing field. If a country gives us open access to their markets, then we can have open access in return. But if the country won't give us open access, I don't see why we should give them open access in a way that's unconditional, that allows them to buy into our assets when we wouldn't be able to buy into theirs.
That's fair enough. That's hard to disagree with that. Robin, it's been said that all truth passes through three stages. First, it's ridiculed. Second, it's violently opposed. Thirdly, it's accepted as self-evident. Is English nationalism inevitable, and how do we keep it benign?
I think it is naturally benign. I mean, one of the things that I find very amusing in terms of the kind of attacks that we get that you were mentioning earlier. I mean, just to take one example, when William Hague was the leader of the Conservatives, he did a radio programme with Jack Straw, and they were both agreeing how awful the English were. William Hague came out with the expression that he thought that English nationalism was the worst form of all nationalisms.
Why? Did he give a reason?
No, but this is in the context where not a single English nationalist has let off a bomb or burnt down a house or done anything that's totally outrageous in the way that some nationalists have done.
Do you think they should?
No, I don't. But the point is that that we're being attacked in that way when in fact English nationalists haven't behaved badly at all. I think the vision is that we represent a threat to the cosy, cushy way of life of the establishment, and that's why they're sort of trying to pigeonhole us in that way.
Could it just be that the establishment, left and right, have decided, having read about the fall of Rome, etc., that imperial decline is inevitable, decline is inevitable, there's nothing they can do, they're going to lose everything, so why not merge with a bigger power and just say goodbye to all their troubles? Is that it, do you think?
Yes, I don't know, really. I haven't thought of it
the whole of this class has said, England's down the Kazi, we might as well go down with it. We don't want to go wherever.
I think the interesting thing about, say, the Conservative Party is that there are many ordinary people within the Conservative Party who would strongly agree with much of what I've been saying.
For sure.
And indeed in the Labour Party. But the fact is that the leadership is very hostile to this, and the leadership are very anti-patriotic, anti-nationalist, so it's in the leadership area that we're getting the resistance. It isn't from ordinary people.
It's the elite, isn't it?
It's the elite.
It's the elite.
The elite feel that it represents a challenge to their position.
And would you agree with me when I say that it's because of this unnatural suppression of patriotism, this idea that it's a bad thing, that we see things like the EDL? I'm not suggesting that the English Democrats have anything to do with the EDL, but I also understand why so many people, working class, youth and slightly older people, are involved in that protest because they feel they've got nothing. They feel they're the last bastion, perhaps, because the politicians tell them they shouldn't be proud of themselves. They shouldn't have these values. And there's nothing wrong with the values they've got, a lot of them.
I look at the EDL in a slightly different way. I think it's interesting that both Kevin Carroll and Stephen Lennon, or Tommy Robinson as he calls himself, are of Irish origin.
Yeah.
And yet have called themselves the English Defence League. And I think that is, and very often if you hear them speak, they talk about Britain and Britishness very interchangeably with England and English. In other words, they're not really in any sense English nationalists, and they're not really particularly interested in England. Their focus seems to be entirely about Islam and the rising threat of Islamists and so on. And I have some sympathy with the idea of the threat of Islamists. I'm not
Islamism rather than...
Yes, I mean, in other words, political Islam. I do think that does represent a threat to the way of life in the West generally. But that's not to say that ordinary Muslims are a threat. I mean, that's completely ridiculous.
They're hard-working people,
exactly.
Good people. Yeah. But a lot of Muslims fall in their army.
I do think that Tommy Robinson saw the fact that if he'd called himself the British Defence League, he'd have got nowhere, because Britishness as a sort of visceral, emotional, punchy concept is dying in England. People are not going to go out on the street to fight about Britishness anymore. But Englishness, I think, that is something that people feel strongly about still.
They do.
And so he's sort of latched on to something that is actually growing in our country.
Let's get on then. We're coming up to... This is a St George's Day show. I'm going to ask you something that no one ever asks about St Patrick, because you and I both know that St Patrick was an Englishman, born in Monmouthshire, and no one ever brings that up. But I'm going to ask you this. St George was a Greek who became an officer of the Roman army. Why are we venerating him?
Well, I don't think we would probably adopt him if we were starting with a blank sheet now. Not that I've got anything against St George. I mean, I think he's a good saint for us to have as a patron saint, because he's obviously a very brave man. He was willing to be tortured to death in a horrible way for his faith by the Roman Emperor Diocletian. And so there's plenty of plus things to say about St George as a saint, but the fact is, that is our emblem. You don't start sort of reinventing the wheel just because you're dealing with a saint that isn't necessarily of English origin. After all, you don't find Scottish nationalists getting terribly upset about the fact that St Andrew was a Palestinian Jew and one of Jesus' inner circle. Who never went anywhere near Scotland.
This sort of ultra criticism is only ever applied to England, the English, and St George, etc.
Yes,
it's a strange thing.
The only patron saint who is actually of the nation that celebrated is, of course, St David, of Wales.
What should we do? How can we make St George's Day more of an event?
Well, I think the thing is, at an ordinary social level, it is becoming more of an event. We are seeing more and more people going out to celebrate it. We are seeing more and more effort put into celebrating it, and more acknowledgement of it as being England's patron saint's day, and England's national day. I've got a Facebook cause, and when we launched that, we got up to getting on for 750,000 people who signed up for it.
That's pretty impressive.
That's probably the vast majority of people who feel themselves English who are actually signed up to Facebook.
So what can people should people be throwing sickies? Should they be booking days holidays? Should they just make it? Because it's up to us, isn't it, to make a stand for England's green and pleasant land?
I like that. It is, and we should. And in fact, certainly our position is that England should celebrate as our national day St George's Day. We intend to do as much as we can about that. We have a candidate standing as mayoral candidate in Doncaster at the moment, and he's saying that he's going to use some of his mayoral salary, a significant part of it, to make sure that St George's Day events are funded, family events are funded in the Doncaster Metropolitan Borough Council. And I think that's the way forward. If our politicians say that they will help make sure that there is a proper celebration of St George's Day, we will wind up with a decent celebration.
St Patrick's Day becoming more of a thing in this country. There was a lot of money involved in that, wasn't there? It was obviously Guinness saw it as a big business opportunity, and we need to convince Charles. Oh, I know Charles Wells Brewery is already there, but we need to convince the other English brewers to get there. Throw their lot in with us.
Well, they should do, but I do notice that actually more and more of them are coming out with George and the Dragon type beers and so on. So I think we are moving that way.
I'm pretty confident the only East London pub that won't be celebrating St George's Day this year will be the one in Walford on EastEnders. Robin, it's been a pleasure talking to you. It's been wonderful to come in. Thank you very much for sparing your time. And we're going to finish with the words that I think you might join me with this. From G.K. Chesterton. St George he was for England, and before he killed the dragon, he drank a pint of English ale out of an English flagon.
St George and England.
This has been the Gary Bushell Show on wonderful Radio Latopia. Check us out at latopia.tv/Gary.